All right, here's our short overview of dramatistic criticism, and we're going to briefly discuss a little background on Kenneth Burke, who's just an important figure in the rhetorical tradition. So, what Kenneth Burke says, he says it takes mystery, adventure, community, and magic to make a human creature. So, Kenneth Burke gets really interested in the ways in which this sense of awe and wonder sort of happen um, in the human experience, right? So we don't just act rationally all the time, but there's all these other confounding elements that go into us wanting to make this, you know, this incredible narrative for ourselves, right? We're narrative, sense-making creatures. We tell our lives through stories. We tell we tell our past through stories. We talk about our future and our dreams and our hopes in regard to stories. That's what Kenneth Burke looks at. So the ways in which people move through the world is as storytelling animals. A little brief background on Kenneth Burke. He attended Ohio State as well as Columbia, but he never actually graduated college, which is just of interest. Um, However, his work was so influential, he just kept writing on his own. He was able to teach and lecture at various colleges throughout his career. And again, now he's a sort of staple figure in the rhetorical tradition. A lot of his work is still used today. Much of literary critique during the time when he was up and coming was driven by Marxism. So if you think about the early 1900s, it's a little pre McCarthyism, but definitely, probably influenced Joe McCarthy to start digging into people's personal lives and political ideologies. Burke, he embraced Marxism for a while, but he eventually broke away from it. So we can do discussion. We've done discussions on Marxism. I'm not going to get into them in depth, but what is of interest is like how would it be used in a literary critique. So one of the ways you can do this is you open up a book and you read it and you say, okay, what narrative is being driven here in order to reinforce current cultural systems, right? So if we're telling stories about if we're watching movies and music videos and consuming art that constantly um, leads people to believe that they should have certain wealth and status and homes and cars and fashion and whatever, right? We've had these sort of marks of symbols of wealth like in the stories, right? These are the things you should be aspiring to, right? That then creates this sort of stratification of class. Like if you have these items, right? If you buy all of the products that Kim Kardashian is pushing on her Instagram, you buy all those things, all of a sudden you gain a certain status in society. And if you don't do those things, you sort of stay down here in this sort of lower class existence, right? So this is what Burke becomes interested in, not Kardashian specifically, but the idea that we tell stories that create this ways that it creates a system in which people at the top stay in positions of power because they have access to being able to tell certain stories. People who don't have access to media stay at the bottom because they don't have access to tell different stories or counter stories. So if you're the one who gets to create the narrative, you get to create narratives that continue to further the fact that, hey, I should be on top and the rest of you should be below me. Right? This is what Burke gets interested in. This is what sort of a Marxist critique of literature, television, film is interested in, is how do we tell stories to keep to keep certain social systems in place, right? How do we tell certain stories in order to keep the wealthy wealthy, the poor people poor, the middle class people content enough not to have some sort of revolution? What sort of stories do we tell that sort of just keep the system working for the people who get to tell the stories? And the people who get to tell the stories, Hollywood, big corporate media, the people in charge of Instagram and Twitter, it's like those are the people who already have their millions and billions of dollars. They're interested in staying there, so they're going to make sure that they push out stories and narratives and algorithms that don't threaten them, right? If anything ever threatens their power, all of a sudden they're like, "Ooh, let's make a different story real quick because I don't want these people down here thinking that they can sort of come after us." All right? So that's what Burke's interested in with regard to literary critiques and Marxism. Um, Burke mentions that man is a symbol using animal, And we want to make sure that we recognize that there's a difference between being rational, which means acting logically, right? And then acting rationally, all right? Acting rationally means I have a goal, right? And however I need to achieve that goal, I'm going to act in that certain way, right? So if my audience wants me to be very emotional and demonize my opponent, then it would be rational of me to act in an emotional way, all right? So being rational just means like, here's all the stats, facts, definitions. I'm going to be a policy wonk. Vote for me because I have the best tax policy and the math works, right? Acting rational means I'm going to act in a way that resonates with my audience. And if my audience doesn't want me to be rational, they want me to be more emotional, I'm going to be more emotional, okay? So one of Burke's first pieces of major influence was this rhetoric of Hitler's battle, right? So again, we're talking, Burke's coming up in the early 1900s. Obviously, he's living through World War II. And what he looked at was the persuasive elements of Mein Kampf, which is, My Struggle, which is Hitler's sort of manifesto, if you will, right? And what Burke noticed was the argument itself was irrational. Right? It wasn't a rational argument, right? It wasn't about numbers and facts and stats and definition, right? But the audience responded to the emotions that Hitler was putting out there. So what Burke concludes is that Hitler was acting rationally based on what he wanted to accomplish. He wanted to get the German people behind him to go out and conquer the world and eradicate the Jews and everything else, right? And Hitler said, well, how are these people going to respond? Well, they're going to respond to the sort of emotional, persuasive elements. And so that's what Hitler gave them in Mein Kampf. So Hitler was acting rationally based on what the audience wanted to hear. His argument was not rational, all right? But he was acting rationally, all right? So then you get to this question of like, why were the Germans attracted to Hitler as a leader? Okay, well, you got to go back to World War I. So a quick little World War I situation. World War I happens. After World War I, the entire world gets mad at Germany for bringing them into World War I. And they say, okay, Germany, we are going to levy sanctions against you. And, you're going to be economically depleted for a while because of what you did during World War I. So Germany goes into this big depression, right? And their money's not worth anything, and people are hurting, and there are no jobs, and people are starving in the streets. Hitler comes along and he says, give me all the power, and I will go and fight on your behalf to, cause great pain and suffering to the world that has put us, the German people, in a terrible situation, right? Hitler was acting rationally because he knew that the desperate people of Germany wanted a leader who would go and fight on their behalf because the world had just crushed the German economy in the aftermath of World War I. And so Hitler said, give me all the power. I'm going to play on your emotions. Desperate people are willing to respond to anything. If you lost your job, if you can't feed your kids, if you have nothing, it's like you're going to respond to emotional arguments. So Hitler knew that. So he went out there and he tugged at the heartstrings of the German people, and they gave him power. And then we got into World War II, right? Also with Germany. All right. So make sure you understand the difference. What Burke says is Hitler was an irrational person, right? The world's problems are not caused by the Jewish people, right? That's a ridiculous, irrational argument. But Hitler had a goal, and the best way for him to accomplish that goal was through these emotional arguments, right? And so he acted rationally based on what the audience needed to hear. And his audience, the German people, needed to hear, give Hitler power, and he's going to make sure that your life is better. He's going to make sure that you have your jobs, your kids are well fed, everything's taken care of, right? That's what people needed to hear emotionally, even though it was an irrational argument. With regard to dramatistic criticism, let's get here, right? All life is a stage, so this is, Shakespearean, right? And what it looks like is it's a fun way to do rhetorical critiques, because what it looks at is you sort of walk around the world and you just realize like everybody's just playing a part, right? Everybody's acting as an actor or an actress. So if you go around and you just start saying like, everybody's just an actor. Like this isn't real. It just becomes a fun way to kind of look at television and even reality, right? We see how people sort of act according to scripts. We watch TV and then we learn from TV how we're supposed to behave in public. So it always starts with a motive, right? The actors must be compelled to act in a certain way, all right? So there's a scene, okay? Kenneth Burke, and again, this comes from Shakespeare, right? All life is a drama, it's all a stage, right? And even again, like the news gets into it. So you look at something like this, right? Kim Kardashian shows off her assets. Ha ha ha. We know what they mean, right? And then you're like, this is on CNN and this is prime time, right? This is prime time. This is, 7 to 11 o'clock. There's probably a lot of important things going on in the world. Even if it's not during a presidential election when this screenshot was taken, but it's like, I bet there was a lot of like struggles and wars and famines going on around the rest of the world. But instead of paying attention to more worldly events, CNN decides to dedicate a segment with political analysts to Kim Kardashian's some picture she posted on Instagram or whatever, right? So you look at it and you're like, why is CNN doing this? Like, this is not a serious news network if they're dedicating any amount of time in the very short amount of time they have to report the news. They're dedicating time to this, right? So you say, well, like, what's the motive? Well, the motive is that the news knows that it also needs to be entertainment because cable news is propped up by advertising, just like every other media company, right? They need to get, people to tune in to their station, right? And then you start saying, okay, well, now all of these individuals are playing a role. These are all actors, right? Yes, they're real people, but they're acting in a way that they think they're supposed to act based on the story and based on the ways in which they've seen other people react to, a Kim Kardashian story. All right. So we start to think of these individuals on sort of like real life news, and we're just like, oh, you're just an actor. You're just playing a role, right? You're probably not really like that in real life, right? So like Don Lemon here, who's an anchor for CNN, he gets into a lot of drama, right? He definitely is hyperbolic. He's a cable news anchor, right? Just like every other cable news anchor, he has his team that he wants to win as far as politics are concerned. And he starts to overreact in very emotional ways where you start to, and if you think of Don Lemon more as an actor as opposed to a serious news anchor, you're like, oh, this makes sense, right? It makes sense that he is overreacting to either political stories or Kim Kardashian Instagram stories or whatever. It's like he's just playing a role. And the reason he's acting in a certain way is because he has learned how to act in a certain way based on the fact that he has been compelled to act by the drama that's going on. All right. We're going to come back to this here momentarily, but let's look at Burke's dramatic Pentad, it's called, right? So there's let's start here with the scene, right? What's the context, right? Set the scene. And then you look at things like, okay, who are the characters? Who are the main characters? Who are the agents? Who are the people acting? All right. Okay. What's the purpose? What is motivated them to act in a certain way? Is it driven by money? Is it driven by, they need to have a contentious debate on cable news. You have to have Democrats versus Republicans, or it's not going to get views, right? If you have a calm conversation between two people who disagree, like nobody cares, right? The act. So what is happening, right? And then finally, agency. How is it done? Who gets to be in charge of the conversation, for instance? Right? Don Lemon is the host. He gets to regulate the debate between the Republican and the Democrat strategist. All right. So this is what Burke talks about as the Pentad. Is all these things are present, and as you walk around the world, as you watch cable news, as you watch real life unfold, you start to sort of notice like, hey, there's a specific scene, and based on the scene, I know that there's certain characters here, and they're supposed to act in a certain way. They're motivated by certain things. And all of a sudden, life becomes very predictable. You can turn on cable news, and based on the story, it's like, oh, based on the story, the big news story today, I can tell you exactly how CNN's going to act. I can tell you exactly how MSNBC is going to act, and I can tell you exactly how Fox News is going to act. I don't even need to turn on the TV anymore because I just start to say like, oh, there's a certain story. What's the context? And I can tell you exactly who the characters are, right? These news anchors are playing characters. They are motivated by partisanship, and they're going to act in certain ways. So let's get back here to the CNN situation, right? You treat every rhetorical act as a narrative as opposed to logic. And the narrative, right, is we're storytelling animals. We want to tell stories, right? What are they trying to accomplish, right? What's CNN trying to accomplish with covering this non-story or non-news story anyway, right? What is the story that what story is they what are they telling to accomplish a specific goal, right? And how would this play off if it was fiction, right? How would this play out if it was a fictional story? So again, this is a real news story, but you start looking at it like, okay, let's just imagine that this is a drama. Let's just imagine that this is fiction for a while, right? So you go back to Kenneth Burke and his work with Hitler's Mein Kampf, right? And he's reading it and he's like, okay, let's act as if this is fiction for a second. Okay, it unfolds as this great struggle between good and evil versus right and wrong, right? You notice this with a lot of political leaders. If you take my 475, my studies in public address class, we do a lot of comparing between important historical speeches between big important political leaders throughout the centuries. And you start to realize the way in which they talk is in this very like good versus evil, right? It's very sort of, sci-fi Star Wars, right? It's like we have to defeat the dark side kind of stuff. That's embedded in all these different sorts of political speeches, even though it's real life. These political leaders have agency. They are promoting certain policies for their people. But the ways in which they write, right? You read like speeches from, Joseph Stalin, right? Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, Fidel Castro, right? Hugo Chavez. You start listening to these, and they're these grand narratives of we're the good guys and the rest of the world is out to get us, right? Give me all the power and I'm going to take care of you. That's a common story, right, throughout political narratives, right? So start to sort of look at the world, look at the news through this sort of this eye of dramatism, and all of a sudden it's a fun way to sort of take this kind of garbage, right, on seeing it. Like you just take it less serious. You're like, this is not a serious news event, right? And all of a sudden you can start to separate some of the emotional arguments from like what is actually logically, rationally important here. All right. So strip away all of the facade of nonsense news stories and try to get into what is actually important. All right. So that's dramatistic criticism. Know who Kenneth Burke is. Just know the name for now. You might want to Wikipedia, Google a little bit more about him. But he's definitely a name that's going to come up a lot more, sort of within the rhetorical tradition. Okay, that's all I have for dramatistic criticism. See you next time.